Neighborhood History Channel for our, excuse me a second, for our, let me see, do I have the right angles on that? Let me see here. Give me one quick second here. Need to wipe off my camera a little bit. Okay, hello and welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel for our, there we are. That's as good as we're going to get. The glare is bad. Let me see here. Hello and welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. This is our third live stream of this weekend, of this Thanksgiving weekend. We are ending in nice fashion with our live stream lecture as usual on Sunday afternoons. We will be going, it is, I believe, 4 o'clock on the East Coast here in the United States, and we will be going for the next hour or so. We started a little bit late because of football reasons, but we will be discussing the impact and legacy of the great Winston Churchill and the causes of World War II from the British perspective. We will also be talking about Churchill's downfall, his shortcomings, his flaws, of which he had many, and why he is such an important historical figure in the modern world. I'm going to turn this light off so that we can get that angle out of the way. Okay, that might be a little bit better for now. So, it's very, very bright for some reason. Anyways, so what can we say about the history and legacy of Winston Churchill? I'll be giving a brief rundown of his biography, what he did, his historical impact, all of those great things about him. And I will be discussing how he kept Britain, his downfall, his political comebacks. Churchill had several political comebacks throughout his career. I will discuss his foresight, his ability, his incisive precociousness, enabled to predict future events and the difficulties of the world around him. I will be discussing his shortcomings, his more racist and imperialist tendencies, where he got those tendencies. I'll be talking a little bit about his personal life. And if you want, this is a more detailed outlay of the video I made yesterday, which is a 10-minute affair, which discusses him on his 150th birthday, born 1874. Churchill's legacy and history is extraordinarily important. He had a particular predilection and disposition towards the United States, probably because his mother was actually an American. He was born in 1874. His father was a member of parliament. I'm trying to remember exactly where his father, how high his father got, but I believe he was a high-ranking member of parliament. Churchill came from a Tory family and remained a strong Tory throughout most of his lifetime. Basically, you have one of the most important figures in Western history, and I'll be discussing it a little bit more. But first, of course, yes, his father was a lord, a high-ranking lord. I believe it was the Spencer Churchill family. His mother was an American. An ancestor of his, Elizabeth Churchill, was a lover of Queen Anne, the queen in the early 1700s, who is most well known for incorporating Scotland into England and creating Great Britain in 1707. The Act of Union, as it was called, was was straight, at least in the fact that she had a husband who she had many children with, all of whom died at a young age. But she also had numerous female lovers, including Miss Elizabeth Churchill, who is an ancestor of Winston Churchill, interestingly enough. So Churchill's pedigree stretches back centuries into British history. His father was a high-ranking lord and member of parliament. His mother was an American, also of high rank and status. The British, Churchill had this high rank and this high view of his Britishness and also of the British Empire and of British politics throughout most of his life. And this is what sets off and triggers a lot of his chauvinistic ideas about the British Empire in relation to other societies. A common belief in Churchill's day, both before, during, and after his time, was this idea of cultural superiority and social Darwinism, that the Western European powers were technologically advanced, they had the Industrial Revolution under their belt, and so they had an obligation, Rudyard Kipling, the British writer, called it the white man's burden, to civilize, quote-unquote, civilize the peoples of the lands that they colonized, because they were clearly inferior. They had been colonized. They were not able to stand on their own 2 feet, and their civilizations needed to be propped up, given the correct infrastructure and education, and then they could run their own governments successfully without any care about the society or culture of those peoples. And this happened in India. The British did this in New Zealand when they mistreated the Aboriginal peoples, the abuse and oppression of the First Nations in Canada, and of course the partitioning and scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, which was eventually settled by the Congress of Berlin when Churchill was only 11 in 1885, basically set up Britain as having a dominant influence in eastern and southern parts of Africa, and they would hold on to these colonies for about 75 years or so. And because they believed they were superior and that their empire was the greatest and that they had brought civilization to these areas, they believed that the races and the peoples of these regions were biologically and politically, economically, socially inferior to them, and their job was to bring the light and the enlightenment and civilization to them. So you had very chauvinistic, very racist ideas and paternalistic ideas where one race basically sees itself as responsible for the upkeep and good treatment of another group. And that was extraordinarily common with the British Empire, and that is how they saw the different colonies. And that's the background that Churchill grew up in. The British Empire was very powerful, was very wealthy. He was born during the reign of maybe Britain's most famous monarch, Queen Victoria, who, although a figurehead, was this extremely important, dynamic and powerful, respected woman all throughout all of Europe. Many of her bloodlines of Europe were related to her directly or indirectly. And during her reign, thanks to the British Empire, its navy, its army, and of course Parliament running the way, the British absorbed India. They got huge parts of Africa. Like I mentioned, they had New Zealand. Canada kind of got its independence, but was still technically in a huge technically a huge part of Great Britain, an ally and dependent upon them. So there was strong colonial presence, and it was said the sun never set on the British Empire because no matter where you were in part of a world where the sun was up. You could be easily part of the British Empire. So if it was nighttime in London, it would be daytime in Australia, and if it was nighttime in Australia, it would be daytime in South Africa, where the British were. And so this is the environment that Winston Churchill was born into, a chauvinistic, racist environment where the British saw themselves as the greatest society in the world. They had the largest empire, they had the largest navy, and they were the wealthiest, and few people in 1874 would have considered anyone to have reached the status of Britain. Russia had the largest amount of land, but it was very backwards. France was extremely wealthy. It was the only successful republic in Europe at this time, despite the fact that they had just gotten rid of their emperor, Napoleon III. Germany was progressing and had a huge amount of natural resources, but they were a relatively new country. So basically, that is the backdrop into which Churchill was born. So if you like what I'm talking about, if you like learning about history, and you're enjoying what you're learning about Winston Churchill and the rise of the British moment, and the start of World War II, which I'll be talking about for the next hour or so on the channel, please like and subscribe. If you were here yesterday or Friday and did not get your questions asked, please drop them in the chat. I will try to give you a few minutes at the end to answer your questions. I know Simon, my wonderful moderator, is here today. It's so good to see you. He has not only put the social media handles in the chat, which I have pinned, which you guys can follow me on Instagram, X, and Facebook. But you can also, of course, he will be handling the comments and seeing if you guys have any questions from people that were here Friday and Saturday during our live stream Q&A. And if we don't get to you today, we can get to you on Friday or Saturday next week. We do 3 live streams. We've done 4 this week because we did a Thanksgiving special on Wednesday. Go check that out. Check out my full-length video on Thanksgiving as well as Winston Churchill. Now that all the promotional stuff is done, consider subscribing. We're trying to hit 6,000, a legion of friendly neighborhood historians ahead of the new year. So basically, by the way, in honor of Churchill, I have a Churchill cigar here that I have started and will be finishing throughout the live stream. So I don't endorse smoking if you're under the age of 21, by the way, but I just felt that it would be in vogue. Honor. So this is the world Winston Churchill was born in, a world where the British Empire was extraordinarily strong, extraordinarily courageous. And by the way, if you're worried about the cigar, take a look at Churchill. Basically, every single picture of Churchill, he is smoking a cigar. You can post a question, but I don't know if we're going to get to it. Ryan, I know you were here for the Q&As. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. Let me see here. So, yes, you are not too late. I started late because football, American football. So we are discussing this is a friendly neighborhood history channel, and we are discussing the life, legacy, and impact of Winston Churchill on our live stream lecture, which will hopefully one day, should the channel become successful enough, morph into the Friendly Neighborhood History podcast. Fingers crossed. We are also considering setting up a Discord. Several people have asked me for my master's thesis, and I'm going to find a way to get that to everybody, maybe make a Substack for it. Today is Winston Churchill. I don't know what we're going to be talking about next week. We almost didn't do a live stream lecture because I had one on Wednesday about the first Thanksgiving. But yes, those are the times. Simon the Bunny, my wonderful moderator, who I appreciate so much for being here, a great Brit who wants to learn more about Great Britain. is putting all of those social media handles in the chat, as well as when we have our live stream lectures and all of that good stuff. So give me 1 second. Yeah, Ryan, you're not the only one. There's a lot of people who don't know a lot about Churchill. So anyways, who is this Winston Churchill? Well, like I mentioned earlier in the chat, in the stream, his father was a lord and a member of parliament. And basically, the way parliament was set up for centuries, any high-ranking person who owned land, nobility, lords, barons, stuff like that, yes, I will be sure to get that to you, Ryan, one way or another. But basically, any high-ranking lord or duke, baron, count, earl was entitled to basically join a parliament and became a member of parliament. And of course, you have the house that represents the middle classes, similar to the Roman assembly, called the House of Commons. An American equivalent would be the House of Representatives, and you had high-ranking members of the society and aristocracy who owned land, who had noble ranks, would be a lord. Therefore, they would join the House of Lords, and that was the case with the Churchills. Again, Churchill's ancestry is quite amazing. He had an ancestor who was a lover of Queen Anne, supposedly, who was bisexual, and you have his mother having an American ancestry, the Spencer side of the family. So Churchill had a predilection and a liking for America and the United States that he kept throughout most of his tenure, most of his political career. So, anyways, so Churchill, interestingly enough, grew up in that lap of luxury and also in this very imperialist notion that the British were the best. I didn't get around to it because I didn't know which war you were talking about, and I will get around to it to the end. I'm just going to talk about Churchill, and then at the very end, I'll be taking questions from people who we missed out on yesterday and Friday. That's my promise to all of you. And if you like what you're hearing, consider liking and subscribing, all that good stuff. Anyways, but it's good to see you again, K. Roach. So Churchill and the history of World War II. Where was I? Oh yes. So Churchill grew up in this lap of luxury with a high rank in British society, and obviously very prim and proper and very well educated, very much following in that pattern. And he joined the military at a young age, as many young British men of high rank did. Many saw it as a status symbol. Churchill served in the army, he served in the cavalry, and then he became a war correspondent and journalist. He was a very gifted writer and would write frequently throughout his lifetime. And he would, no, it didn't. Anyways, he took, and obviously, as I mentioned, the British at this time were taking over large parts of Africa. So Churchill went to Africa. He went to Afghanistan, where the British were able to control the foreign policy, but were never quite able to conquer the tribalistic Afghan people. But he went all around the British Empire, touring it in the late 1800s and detailing what happened. He served in what's called the Second Boer War in South Africa, where the British once again fought Dutch colonists for settlement and control of the region and were able to beat them by 1902. And so a young Winston Churchill served in the cavalry. He fought in the war. He became a war correspondent and journalist. He went all around the British Empire. He went to India and Afghanistan and covered the British Empire, and as he saw the British Empire from the perspective of a Brit, and he saw the peoples of these regions, he became more and more convinced of the notion of British imperialism and social Darwinism, that the British were there for a purpose, and the purpose was to civilize these rude barbarians. Churchill also proved himself to be quite insightful. Noticing the land, the topography, and the people groups of Afghanistan, he noted that they were not easy to colonize and that they could not be easily conquered. He recognized that Alexander the Great and the Greeks had failed to hold on to Afghanistan in the 300s BC. He also realized that the British could not firmly hold on to it and that no one could firmly hold on to that region, as it was a crossroads, and B, a land with strong tribalistic notions that had kept their people in check. And also it was a land of very difficult geographical and topographical challenges that no modern military would be able to overcome. The Soviet Union did not learn this lesson in the 1980s, nor did the United States in the 2000s and 2010s. But Churchill gave those words of wisdom in the early 1900s. So he's an amazing, yes, that is what Churchill would be saying. But basically, Churchill found himself able to travel the entire British Empire. He certainly had the wealth and the good connections to do so, and he also was at this time proving himself successful militarily, but also even more successfully as a writer. We don't know, people do not talk about Churchill's personal life. Some people know about his commentary on Afghanistan and his service in the Boer War and his racist, imperialist feelings about the native groups in Africa, be they the Bantu people in Africa, the Afghans, or the Indians, who he believed were not able to rule themselves and that the British had better intentions. He was extraordinarily prejudiced against the Aboriginal peoples of New Zealand, the Maori, and the Aborigines in New Zealand or Australia, who he considered to be inferior and unable to create a good enough society. So the British, who created a good enough society, in his opinion, were able to lord it over them. And he remained convinced of this until his death in the 1960s and remained anti-decolonization, very pro-colonization, very pro-imperialist. It's one of the scars on Churchill's legacy and has led many modern people to question his legitimacy and his ethical behavior, as well as even question his status as a great figure. People have been questioning that for a long time, usually coming more from a left-wing perspective, but even people on the right are starting to question whether Churchill is really a hero. Was he the hero of World War II that we think he is, or should we hold these things over his head? And yes, we need to acknowledge them, and that's why I'm talking about them, but we also need to realize that most historical figures who accomplished great things, Washington, Churchill, they are not easily, Julius Caesar, these men are not great people in every way, shape, or form. Churchill is also very brutish, he's rude, he's often brusque, and stubborn to a point of failure. And he isn't always right, but he is very incisive. His commentary about Afghanistan was spot on at the time, and this is not the first or last time that Churchill is going to make a commentary about a group of people or an area and be absolutely right about what he is saying. But he's also going to be wrong about a lot, and that brings me to the next part of Churchill's story. So after returning from the front, and after touring the British Empire and becoming a war correspondent and rising in the military ranks, Churchill takes his father's place and assumes all of the airs that a lord would, and he becomes a member of Parliament. A huge part of his life that is not known about is his personal life. We don't know a lot about Churchill. We know he had a wife, but I'm going to enlighten you a little bit there. Some people know about the racism and the imperialism and what he said about Afghanistan. Everybody seems to know about World War II, but a lot of people do not know that Churchill, around the time of him returning from the front, met and fell in love with Clementine Hoysier, a lady of unsure origin who had both British and Russian blood in her. And they met in 1904 when Churchill was 30 and she was 18, very common back then especially. And they fell in love and got married 4 years later, and they had 5 children, one of whom died at the young age of 2 from sepsis. I believe it was a daughter. But Churchill and her, she was the most important person in Churchill's life. She was his most devoted companion and follower, and she stood by him in every way, shape, and form, and actually led relief efforts and helped connect Britain to the Russians, the Soviet Union, during World War II in bringing relief, food, and shelter and clothing to the people who were suffering, because many millions of people in Russia were dying after the Germans invaded in the 40s. So Churchill's wife Clementine, his darling Clementine, was extremely important in his life and extremely important for his work, and she remained by his side until his death in 1965 at the age of 90. She would go on to live to be 92, dying in 1977, and they are actually buried together. So we don't look at Churchill and think of a romantic. I don't know how romantic he absolutely was, but he seemed very devoted to her and her to him. And a lot of people do not talk a lot about this, and I think it needs to be mentioned. I think the personal lives of some of these great historical figures shed a lot of light on their character and conviction, and I think Churchill proved himself to be a pretty good spouse for the most part. So I think that Churchill and Clementine deserve a story in the books of the best romances, at least in contemporary history, for political figures. Nowadays, when political figures can't seem to stop getting divorced, Churchill was married to one woman for most of his life. Yes, he was also devoted to his booze, that's for sure. So Churchill, again, I'm talking about the good and the bad. Churchill also had a big problem with addiction, a big struggle with alcohol throughout most of his political career, and overate, and of course smoked cigars. Now, of course, I'm I have a cigar. This is mainly for show and the Churchill thing. I don't smoke that often, and I would encourage people not to become addicted to any form of tobacco or any other substance for that matter. Although being addicted to coffee doesn't really have its shortcomings, in my opinion. Churchill met Clementine in 1904. He marries her in 1908. She's only 22. He's in his mid-30s now, and he is starting to rise in the ranks. He's become an MP. He's a very loyal and committed Tory, and the Tory party is one of the two major parties in Britain at this time, across from the Liberal Party, which would be a moderate center-left party now, as opposed to the Labour Party, which is the major left-wing party in Britain to this day. And currently, I think it's Stremmer is his name, Carl Stremmer. Kerry Stremmer. He is the Prime Minister of Great Britain right now, and he is of a Labour Party. The Conservative Party held swing over British politics for 15 years before that, with Prime Ministers like Theresa May and Boris Johnson, who got some comparisons to Churchill, despite being not nearly as great of a leader or motivator as Churchill was. Yes, Strammer, not Streamer. I do not have any bourbon to accompany the cigar. Now you know what to get me for Christmas. But anyways, Kayer Stremmer. Thank you, Simon. I appreciate that. But they just took power, I believe, and now, and who knows how that's going to go. The British are very good at changing political leadership, as you will find out in learning about Churchill. You're going to learn a lot about British politics. Churchill rises in the ranks of the Conservative Party, and the way, if you are American, the way the British parliamentary system works is fundamentally different than Congress and the president. In the United States, you have a separation of branches based on the French philosopher of the Enlightenment, Montesquieu. The British don't have that. And a lot of parliamentary systems, such as Israel and Germany, don't have that. Now, they have a court system. They have a bureaucracy, a federal bureaucracy that handles things. They have subsidiary branches. But the federal system is at its peak in the United States because you have a president who runs one department, a court that runs another department, and Congress, and they all interplay with each other, and one is not supposed to be greater than the other to a large extent. In Britain, Parliament is based on majority, and usually, and this is the case in Germany and Israel and the Knesset and France as well. Basically, you have not two major parties like in the United States, but you have 4 to 6, maybe 7 or 8 strong major parties that everyone knows, then a couple smaller minor ones. And the major parties are relying on the side parties to help them sometimes. Now, in Britain right now, the Conservative and the Labour are the overwhelming popular, just like Conservative and Liberal in Canada. Those are the overwhelmingly popular parties in Great Britain to this day. But there are smaller parties like the Reform or the Green Party, just like the US has a Green Party. So basically, sometimes different parliamentary systems rely on different parties joining their government in order and giving political concessions to them in order to get a majority. You don't always get 55 to 60% of the seats in Parliament. You might get 40 to 45, and then you need to make up the 5 to 10% difference by getting some other people. And this routinely happens in Europe. It happens in Britain to a lesser degree than in France, Germany, or Israel, but it does happen sometimes. But in the case of the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, throughout Churchill's career, there's going to be 2 to 3 major political parties: the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the Labour. And Churchill is a Tory. He is a committed Tory and conservative who support the monarchy, who support traditional British values, and of course support the empire at this point, and are known for their chauvinism when it comes to that. And the Tory party is in power at this time, and Churchill will rise in the ranks to become High Lord of the Admiralty, which is an extremely important position for such a young man. The Admiralty is important because Britain has the largest navy in the world at this point, and the British Navy is the stuff of legend, and it has been for centuries. It was what curved Napoleon. It defeated its inception. Its rise to power began with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It secured the naval advantage in order to secure such a huge land empire where the sun never set. The reason the British are able to have Burma, India, Australia, Canada, and Africa, and huge parts of Africa in all of these places, as well as Guyana and South America, is because of their navy, and and the navy secures their mercantile empire, which secures their wealth and power and promise. So, basically, what we have is an extremely strong British Navy. And who is in charge of it other than Lord Winston Churchill coming 1913, 1914? Now, of course, 1914, World War I, or as I like to call it, World War II, starts with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and then the dominoes knocked over one after another. Fun fact, and this is stuff I've talked about many times on the channel, Britain did not want to get involved with World War One. Britain typically throughout most of the 19th century wanted to do a lot of empire building while ignoring the Europeans, ignoring the French, Germans, Russians, Austrians, Italians, and all of their political nonsense. They wanted to basically leave Europe behind, and this is something that Britain is still struggling with to this day. How much of Europe is Britain, and how much of Europe's issues are Britain's issues? This is the whole issue of the Brexit strategy. Britain, throughout most of the 19th century, wanted to let Europe handle Europe. But one country they couldn't ignore was the country of Belgium. So when the Germans invade Belgium to get to France in the beginning of World War I and violate Belgian neutrality, surprising the Germans, the British, with their navy, led by Churchill, decide to get involved in the conflict. And the British Navy is going to be extremely important. It's going to put a blockade around Germany that's eventually going to lead to Germany's decline and surrender. It's going to protect ships. It's going to fight against the German U-boats, which are particularly obnoxious and difficult for the Allies to deal with, Britain, France, and later the United States, throughout World War I, especially when the Germans enact unrestricted submarine warfare to destroy any ships that are carrying munitions or supplies to the Allies. So Germany is going to be pretty relentless throughout most of the war and pretty aggressive, which is basically going to tick off the United States, Argentina, China, Japan, and a bunch of other places that will all join against them. So Germany is very good at turning people against them during World War I. But Britain's going to join the war, and there's going to be a nasty trench warfare with thousands dying for a few hundred feet or yards of space in France and Belgium for the next 4 years, while the naval war is more up and down, and there's a lot of fighting in the North Sea, and Churchill is going to be overseeing most of this throughout World War I, and he's actually going to be pretty successful. However, his biggest political failure is yet to come. Now, a lot of people think of Winston Churchill and they know about World War II. Some of them may even know what I said earlier. Probably the second best thing known about Churchill is that he was a political comeback kid. He had lost horribly in the past before he rose to power in the 1940s and was able to challenge and take on the Nazis. But he actually was a political failure. At least that's how a lot of people saw him in the 1920s. And he spent most of the 20s traveling around and kind of sitting in the shadows, not being as important or as aggressive as you would think someone like Churchill, who has the face of a bulldog and is often compared to the stubborn, stalwart bulldog in his own way. I've made a video about that as well. But Churchill basically makes a huge blunder in World War I that almost destroys his political career and basically makes him put to the side and makes him a pariah for the British government, and that is the Gallipoli campaign. So in 1914, at the end of the year, the Ottoman Turks joined the side of the Central Powers, and they're called the Central Powers because it's Central Europe, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and they're going to join to retake their power in the southeastern part of Europe called the Balkans and get back at the Russians. The British realized that the war is now going to be fought in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. So the British bump up the Arabian rebels to thwart the Turks in Saudi Arabia and most of the Middle East, and they're going to be assisted by a very famous man named T.E. Lawrence, a British officer, who of course becomes Lawrence of Arabia. At the same time, the fighting in the Mediterranean, there's still fighting in Africa between the German colonies and the British. There's fighting in North Africa between the Turks and the British and the French. So what the British decide to do, and the French and the Australians, who, again, they're a colony for the British, so they get drummed into the war. Any of the colonies go to fight. Churchill has this interesting idea. Churchill believes that it would be great to open a third front in the war, ignoring the fact that the Greeks are going to join the war soon afterwards and fight the Turks. There's going to be a lot of fighting in Turkey. Bulgaria is going to be on the side of the Central Powers. Romania is going to join. There's going to be a bunch of fighting in southeastern Europe that you never hear about in World War I because it's always centered on when does the United States join and when does Russia become communist. But there's a southeastern front to the war, as well as a Middle Eastern front, an African front, and an Asian front, where the Germans are going to be particularly important. But Churchill believes that opening up a new front in Turkey itself will actually weaken the Ottomans and put pressure on them to drop out of the war. So he enlists the help of the Australian conscripts and, with the approval of the French and the Parliament, devises the Gallipoli campaign. It's a strategy where the British take their naval power through the Dardanelles, the straits near Constantinople, in western Turkey, and in order to cut the Ottoman Empire in half and surround Constantinople, this ancient city called Istanbul now by the Ottomans, Churchill sends forces to land on the Turkish mainland. And the Turks are heavily fortified. The Turks are very strong, and they are able to destroy most of the Allied forces who land at the shores of Gallipoli. So the Gallipoli campaign of 1915 is a total disaster. Thousands of Australian soldiers die. The British die. The French die. It goes nowhere, and it's a huge win for the Ottoman Turks. And because of that, they start to put more pressure on the Greeks, who would have dropped out of the war had the British not sent more forces there. So there's a lot of problems going on with the war so far. There's a lot of problems going on, and Churchill isn't handling them well. And the failure of the Gallipoli campaign basically gets him pushed off to the side, and his rising political career, his rising star on Downing Street, seems to have gone out. And for the rest of the war, he's gonna kind of be put on the sidelines. If I am correct, he won't be Lord of the Admiralty much longer after the war. But he is absolutely humiliated. And that is why one of Churchill's most famous statements is never, ever, ever give up. Churchill realized that he had made a huge political blunder, he had cost the lives of thousands of men, and that history would look very unfavorably upon him. But he did not give up. He refused to surrender, and he would tell Britain the very same thing 25 years later. No one could have predicted after Gallipoli that Churchill would ever become prime minister. No one could have predicted that we would be talking about Churchill as one of the most important historical figures of all time 100 years later, after the disaster, the Gallipoli campaign. But Churchill never, ever gave up. So what happens next? So Churchill's really a story of stubborn bone and steel, really, when you think about it. So the war starts to wrap up. The Russians are overwhelmed by a revolution in February of 1917, which turns into a communist coup in the late fall. And Churchill is going to be the incisive one to actually be able to see what's happening there. Churchill is the first politician to speak out against the communist revolution in Russia. He believes that it's extremely dangerous, and he believes that the Allies need to send in forces, the British and the Americans do, in order to back up the Russians and get them back into the fight. And eventually these forces will join the side of the White Russians, who want to continue fighting in the war against the Bolsheviks, the Red Army, who want to pull the Russians out of the war, and this causes a civil war in Russia. Now, as World War I starts to peter out and the Germans lose their wherewithal, the Americans back up the Europeans, and the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians collapse and the war comes to an end, the British decide to start pulling their forces out of Russia. There is no need to bring the Bolshevik Soviets back into the war because the war is over. There is no need for a new, renewed Eastern Front because of the fear of Russia being pulled out of the war. Churchill is going, and a lot of British parliamentarians, including conservatives, especially, and of course headed by their new prime minister, the famous liberal politician David Lloyd George, are going to insist that Britain get out of Russia as soon as possible and let the Russians fight amongst themselves between red and white. But Churchill, who is incisive and very good at predictions as always, says there's a huge problem with the Soviets, that the Bolsheviks are not to be trusted and that they have dangerous and totalitarian designs, and that it would be best for the British to stay there and help the White Russians defeat the Red Army and destroy the Bolshevik Revolution. This doesn't happen. The White Russians are crushed, and Russia becomes the Soviet Union in 1921 with Vladimir Lenin as its first head of state. And they are going to be a challenge again and again throughout history. And obviously, this is the same Soviet Union from the Cold War. This is the same Soviet Union of the atrocities of people like Stalin and Brezhnev. And Churchill foresaw, maybe not exactly that, but he foresaw danger coming from communism in Russia and believed that it would lead to untold amounts of suffering, and believed that it was the job of the British and the French and the Americans, war-weary as they were, to knock the Russians back, to give the Russians a chance at liberal democracy with the victory of the White Russians. So basically, Churchill saw ahead that there was danger in Russia, and that there was danger coming from the future Soviet Union. And once again, just like he said with Afghanistan, made a very incisive ahead of time prediction. He was the only politician who was willing to do this. Even after being disgraced by the Gallipoli campaign, Churchill proved to be adamant. He proved to be very principled and very stubborn, and he refused to back down, and he made his voice known, even when it was unpopular, even when he was already losing his popularity, even when he had already disgraced himself with Gallipoli. The war-weary British were not ready to continue such a conflict. Churchill was probably overestimating Britain's war resolve, and so they settled for ending the war with the Germans instead. Now, Churchill, if I am correct, believed the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I with the Germans was a terrible idea and that things would not look well. There was a very famous French general, Ferdinand Foch, the leader of the Allies, of the Allied forces in France, who basically said there will be another war in 20 years thanks to Versailles. So Churchill also didn't like Versailles. Of course, Churchill is going to spend the 1920s kind of in the political shadows. He's going to travel a lot. He's going to write a lot. He's going to speak a lot. That's what Churchill does whenever he's not in the political forefront. He's going to travel around the world. He's going to make a lot of statements. He's going to do a lot of things. He continues to believe, as independence movements grow in Africa and especially India with the Indian National Congress founded in the 1930s, that despite the noble civil disobedience of Mohandas Gandhi, who learned his principles from the British and from French philosophers of the Enlightenment, that India does not deserve and has not earned the right to have its own nation, and that they should still be part of the British Empire. And that's Churchill's continuing conviction throughout the 1920s and 30s. So this is where Churchill is at this point. He has seemingly dropped off the map. It doesn't seem like he's going to be politically significant. The 1920s are dominated by economic strength thanks to the United States and wealth and prosperity, jazz, new traditions, greater rights for women. Lady Astor becomes the first woman in Parliament in 1919. Britain is going to enjoy kind of a mini jazz age, mini Roaring Twenties, comparable to the United States, who owns most of its debt at this point, and the United States, which didn't receive the damage and loss of life that the British received, is going to rise as Britain is going to decline. And Churchill came to realize that the Americans were going to become extraordinarily strong throughout the rest of the century. He famously said the Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options. So Churchill, in his own way, obviously with kind of this mixed background, has a lot of affinity for the United States, but like any good Brit of their stripe, he sees the United States as a little brother kind of thing. And back then it certainly was definitely an issue there. So Churchill, meanwhile, the Labour Party comes to power. Ramsay MacDonald becomes the first Labour Prime Minister. Lloyd George falls out of power. And the Conservatives and Labour fight back and forth throughout most of the 1920s and into the 30s. Then the Great Depression hits, and when the Great Depression hits the United States, it also hits Britain and the rest of Europe as well, because they rely on the United States because they own so much of the debt of these countries. So when the American economy collapses in the early 30s, the British, French, and especially the German economy will collapse. The Germans have been stabilizing during the 1920s. In fact, today is the anniversary of the Locarno Agreement, in which a bunch of European countries, including the Germans, agreed for a perpetual peace in Europe. Kellogg-Briand, all of these different agreements. Despite the rise of totalitarian government in Italy, and of course the rise of Stalinism in Russia, which is going to be extremely repressive and violent, which Churchill will once again condemn and see ahead of time as a danger to the world, you have Italy. You had Italy, the rise of fascism in Italy. And Benito Mussolini, who is a right-wing dictator, at least that's what a lot of people seem to think, although he was a former socialist, who basically sees socialism as stupid because it involves he doesn't want workers of the world to unite. He wants all the classes of Italy to unite to make Italy as powerful as possible and to basically throw off the yoke of what their insults. The Treaty of Versailles and other treaties in the war had not given Italy what they had wanted at the end of World War I, and so Italy becomes more militarized. Japan becomes more militarized because they didn't get what they wanted at the end of World War I. And Germany is going to stabilize in the 20s, but because of the Great Depression and everything, there's going to be a rise in extreme parties, communism and Nazism. And the Germans basically picked their poison, and they picked Nazism, with Paul von Hindenburg and the right thinking that the Nazis will destroy the socialists. And you obviously have the rise of the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler. Now, Churchill, ahead of time, sees the problem with this, and perhaps in his most bold prediction ever, he believes that the Nazis are extremely dangerous and must be stopped at all costs. He also notices that the Nazis have a particular predilection against the Jews, and he knows that Europe's Jews are in existential danger because of the actions of the Nazis. Now, Churchill on his own, like many people, again, a victim of his time, did not have the most loving attitude towards the Jews, but he didn't want them to be completely exterminated or discriminated against, and he realized that's what the Nazis wanted to do. So throughout the 1930s, Churchill is going to continue to be a warning siren, similar to, I'm trying to remember the name of the prophet from Troy, the prophetess who predicted that the Trojan horse would destroy the city. I'm trying to remember her name. But he continues to be that woman. I think it was Circe. He continues to be the Circe of Europe, continuing to say the Nazis will show up. Zolt, I know, I've heard that phrase a lot of time. The victors write the history. Think of World War II and what I'm talking about right now. How would you like the Nazis to have written the history? How would that have done? So basically, meanwhile, fascism is on the rise, militarism is on the rise, and Japan is continually aggressive. In 1931, they invade China. They invade Manchuria. 6 years later, they invade China. Spain falls into a civil war, which the British support the left-wing Republicans, which they just wanted a Republican government with no king. It's not the Republicans like in the United States. And the Germans and the Nazis and the Italian fascists support Franco and the Loyalists, who will establish a semi-fascist dictatorship in Spain starting in 1938. Where once again, the Europeans and the United States after World War II will pick their poison. Not wanting Spain to be communist, they'll allow Franco to stay in power despite his repression of his people. Yes, so Churchill sees Kristallnacht, he sees the Night of the Long Knives, he sees the totalitarian rise of Hitler, and he sees the existential threat it poses to Slavic peoples, disabled people, and especially the Jews, and he warns about it in 1937, 1938. He sees things are happening that are dangerous. The Germans start to violating the Treaty of Versailles by building up their military as high as they can get it. In fact, they go over the limit to basically just beef up their military, and then they invade. They take over the Rhineland, which they weren't supposed to do. They were not supposed to have military in the Rhineland, yet they send in tanks in 35. In 37, they unite with. They make the Anschluss, where they basically unite with Austria, and the Austrians welcome them, embracing Nazism. And the French and the British start to raise their eyebrows a little bit. Now the conservatives have come to power, and Churchill is, by the way, back at Downing Street. I'm trying to remember his position in Parliament at this time. I think he was he was not war. Was it post? It was some position. Was he back in charge of the Admiralty? Basically, Churchill is back at Downing Street in the Prime Minister's cabinet of the new Prime Minister, a man named Neville Chamberlain. Now, Chamberlain has become synonymous with stupidity in history, but let's not fault Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, the French executive, and later Paul Reynaud. These men believe that the best thing that they could possibly do as center-right people is promote peace and appease the Nazis. They didn't want another great war. There was only one world war in their eyes, and they didn't want another one. They called it the Great War, the war to end all wars, because hopefully there wouldn't be any more wars. So they basically decide that they will make compromises with Hitler, the Nazis, and the Italians. Meanwhile, Mussolini has invaded Ethiopia, thrown out Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, and taken over Libya and Albania. Selassie goes to the League of Nations, which was set up after World War I to create peace. Fun fact, they didn't. And condemns the actions. The British send aid to the Ethiopians. Churchill buddies up with Selassie. And war crimes are committed by both the British and the Italians in Ethiopia in the 30s and 40s, and nobody talks about it in history, but it's pretty atrocious. So you've got Italy, you have Japan becoming more dangerous, invading China. You've got the British and French Empire threatened by Japan's militarism. And you obviously have the Germans and them sweeping up Austria. And now Hitler wants a land in Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. And it's a German name. It's mainly German people. And Hitler's argument is Germans should be with other Germans. And Churchill says, no, this is a horrible idea. If you give the mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk too. If you let Hitler have a free hand in Czechoslovakia, he will take as much land as he wants. But the bulk of the party, especially the Secretary of War and the Prime Minister, Edward Halifax and Neville Chamberlain respectively, in order to avoid a repeat of World War I, basically make appeasement their number one goal, and they meet with Hitler at a meeting convened by Mussolini called Munich, where they basically ignore the demands of a Czechoslovakian president and allow the Germans to take the Sudetenland. Later, in early 1939, Hitler's tanks roll in German blitzkrieg, lightning war, and take half of Czechoslovakia. And now the Europeans are starting to raise their eyebrows. He's violated the agreements of Munich. And Churchill had warned about this. He had said that Hitler would not follow suit and obey any law made for him. So following this, Churchill warns again. you need to not let him go farther into this conflict. He's going to continue to advance. Then on August 24th, 1939, things really surprised the British as the Russians, who supposedly hate the Nazis, and the Nazis who supposedly hate the Russians, make an agreement called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where two of the most brutal and awful people in human history, Hitler and Stalin, basically agreed not to attack each other and to split up Poland. And Britain and France are now worried that there could be a war. A week later, Germany invades Poland, and then the Soviets follow suit a couple weeks after that. This is the beginning, September 1st, 1939, of World War World War II. And Churchill and Chamberlain is still in power. The Conservatives are still in power. He has embarrassed himself many times. Churchill is knocking at the door and saying, we cannot appease, we have to fight, we have to stop them. And now it seems like it might be too little too late. The Poles are ground into subservience and overtaken by the Russians and the Germans, who, by the way, a large portion of the Polish population is Jewish, and the vast majority of Jews who died during the Holocaust are Eastern European and Polish Jews. So if people had listened to Churchill's warning ahead of time, the Holocaust may not have happened in the way that it did. Who knows what would have happened instead? But it's very possible that you could have avoided World War II and perhaps hit Hitler before he got too powerful and too cocky. And before he saw the Europeans as pushovers, which by the time he invaded Poland, he definitely saw Britain and France as pushovers. So you've got the, basically you've got, yes, Japan did that at the end of World War I. I'm looking at the chat real fast. If you like what I'm talking about, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm going to take a quick break to do a puff on my cigar and catch my lungs. What did I skip, Robin? Did I miss something? I think I've gotten most of the main facts about Churchill, most of the stuff we know about or may not know about. Hopefully you've learned something. If you've learned something, consider liking and subscribing. I got my lighter instead. Ah, jeez. There we are. Okay, so they didn't do anything because they don't want two wars, one against the Soviets and one against the Germans. You don't want to fight a war against the Soviet Union. Stalin has rapidly industrialized the Soviets. They have so much land, and they have tens of millions of men who know that if they don't fight for the Soviet cause, they will be killed by political commissars with pistols. Yeah, I do need a Zippo. I would love a Zippo because those are very retro. Yeah, there would be a very different type of history podcast. But in the style of Winston Churchill, I have decided, that's a horrible Churchill impression, I have decided to go with a cigar. By the way, this would be a nice time to give you a little bit about the details about Churchill's wit and if you want to call it that. So Churchill obviously loved his cigars. He loved to drink. And throughout World War II, there were many times when he was drunk in Parliament. Churchill was also known for being very fun-loving and able and quick on his feet. He loved to battle back at people, and he could also be very rude with doing this. This is why a lot of people, perhaps falsely, have compared him to Donald Trump. They think that Churchill was never afraid to speak his mind like Trump, and Churchill was not afraid to be rude. So supposedly, one day, this is when he becomes prime minister, a female MP from the Labour side, and if you've ever seen British or Canadian Parliament, they're constantly yelling over each other. It's fun to watch sometimes. It's far more fun than the American, where it's like, and then on the fourth resolution, there can be a lot of fun times where you have them jeering at each other, and here, and all of that good stuff. But Churchill was sitting and giving a speech, and he was clearly slurring, and it wouldn't make any sense. This is not his Never Surrender speech or his Iron Curtain speech that he's well known for. He was clearly intoxicated. And this lady, MP from the Labour side, who sits across from the Conservatives, says, "Oh my God, the Prime Minister is drunk." And Churchill responded, and this is my best Churchill impression that I can do, and yes, he was a bulldog, "Madam, I may be drunk, but in the morning I shall be sober, and you will still be ugly." I mean, if that's not Trumpian, I don't know what is Trumpian. And Churchill just was very quick on his feet. One woman, Lady Astor, I think it's the same Lady Astor who was the first woman in Parliament, said to him at a dinner party, she said, "Oh, if you were my husband, I would poison your tea." And he said, "Madam, if you were my wife, I would drink the tea." So Churchill was quite an interesting guy, to say the least, and had an ability to turn people on their head and to zing, very strong zings, and often very rude. Things you wouldn't consider saying. I mean, if somebody came up to you and said, "I would poison your soda, or your coffee, or your beer," would you really have the wit and the quickness to say something like that in response? I don't think so. But Churchill was quite an interesting and fun guy. And if you like those stories, if you like learning about Churchill, check out my videos on him. Consider liking and subscribing. And if you even if you hated the impression, I did my best to do a good Churchill impression. Yeah, Churchill was very quick on his feet. One more one. Supposedly, there was a London dinner party he went to, and he was sitting next to a Methodist parson. And Methodists are known as teetotalers; they don't drink alcohol, which is very funny with Churchill being an alcoholic, a bad alcoholic. And this Methodist parson, this serving girl comes out to the parson and to Churchill, and she offers them serving glasses of alcohol. Churchill gladly takes it because he's Churchill, and then she offers it to the parson, and the parson just is shocked. "Oh, how dare you offer me this?" He yells at her. He says, "I would rather commit adultery than imbibe an intoxicant." And as she's walking away, Churchill says, "Come back, my dear. I didn't know that we had a choice." So Churchill was quite a funny guy, quite quick on his feet. Yes, and maybe that wit, maybe that ability to be quick on your feet is what makes him a good leader, is that he was incisive and he was able to make these very fun predictions and do all of these fun things. And I know a lot about the Mughal Empire, the name Indian word for Mongol, the powerful Sunni Muslim empire that ruled India in the 16th and 17th and 18th century. But we're not talking about that today. I'm trying to hold on and see if we can do any questions at the end. We're almost to an hour now. But anyway, so Churchill in World War II. So the Germans invade Poland, and Chamberlain is still in power. Oh, is it out again? Oh, darn it. Anyways, shows you how often I smoke. Anyways, so the point being, Churchill is still in power, and Chamberlain's still in power, and you obviously are getting very worried. In 1940, Hitler quickly takes over Denmark, and then he waits for a little while, and Chamberlain says, "Oh, it seems like Mr. Hitler is losing his nerve." Then Hitler invades Belgium and the Netherlands, knocks them out, and France looks like it is now in the crosshairs. And Chamberlain finally, after being disgraced time and time again, resigns in disgrace and turns his government over to Churchill. Chamberlain is also dying of cancer, but he continues to be a leading member in the parliament, and him and Halifax will continue to demand that Churchill find a peaceful resolution to the war, believing that appeasement can still happen, even though Hitler has proven he is far beyond appeasement. And Churchill, at this point, has been proven right time and time again, but neither Chamberlain nor Halifax want to really admit that Churchill has been right about any of this. So what happens next? Well, the next story is one of the most famous in all of history, and it obviously is one of the most embarrassing in French history. The French, after the end of World War I, built a series of fortifications called the Maginot Line, north at the northern border near the Netherlands and Belgium, to keep the Germans from invading, because that's where World War I was fought. They don't want their own soldiers to die on their territory. And Hitler decides to blitzkrieg his tanks through the Ardennes, a forest to the south, and go around the Maginot Line. And basically, the blitzkrieg works extremely well in France, and they get to Paris before you can say boo. The French are knocked out of the war. Churchill, actually, who is now in power, recommends that Renault, the Prime Minister of France, lets Britain annex France so that they can have a French empire that can take on the Germans. And the French say no, because they don't want the British in charge, and they don't want the Nazis in charge. So better the devil you know than the devil you don't, I guess. So, maybe we maybe we can super chat that. That'd be fun. But anyways, so point being, Churchill now is faced with the fact that the Germans have really done a number on the French. As French soldiers are dying covering the British forces, the British evacuate at Dunkirk, and thousands of British boats and ships and their navy get them back to England safely. I think it was 240,000 men. The story of Dunkirk, one of the most interesting in World War II that we don't talk about as much. And so you have the British Expeditionary Force back in Britain. You have France caving to the Nazis, and the Germans will set up a puppet government called Vichy France, which will basically do what they say, including turning over huge numbers of Jews to be liquidated. And then you have the Soviet Union is now invading Finland. Japan takes over Indochina. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the French colonies there. The Italians and the Germans are starting to attack the British in Egypt, so the fighting has now spread to Africa, and C. Law Montgomery will continue to do his best to try to hold back hold back the Italian and German forces. And while the Italians are mincemeat in World War II and absolutely dog feathers, the Germans remain very, very strong and resolute. So this is the darkest hour. This has the point where Churchill has a difficult decision. Now, something a lot of people don't know about in history is that Hitler actually was a bit of an Anglophile. So were many of the Germans. Hitler had a lot of respect for the British Empire. He understood their power and their might, and he realized that he probably couldn't successfully destroy the British, at least through an invasion. He idolized Napoleon, and he realized that Napoleon would not be able to was not able to overcome and defeat the British, so neither would he. So he was willing to give favorable terms to the British, probably some concessions in territory, but also basically, if Germany had gotten this deal to the British, they would be able to leave the war pretty unscathed, but Germany would have a free hand to do whatever it wanted in Europe. And of course, that would mean disaster for the Jews, disaster for the French, who have their resistance, which apparently every Frenchman was in after World War II. And who knows what will happen in the East. Russia has seemingly become allied with the Germans, and that doesn't make any sense, because they're supposed to hate each other. The Japanese are making mincemeat of the Chinese, and have taken French colonies, and so they are now precariously close to Malaysia and Siam, which are owned by the British, and to Papua New Guinea and Australia, which are British colonies, and they also are close to India. So the British Empire is in danger, and they are in a precarious position. They're not at war with Japan, but things are only getting worse. Seeing Hitler's aggressiveness in taking over France, Mussolini joins the war and invades the southern part of France and takes it for himself. So now you have a huge problem. You have Britain alone. Of course, it has its empire. It has Canada, it has Australia, it has New Zealand, it has the African colonies, which are fighting like heck to keep the Germans from taking over. You have this massive empire and, of course, this huge navy, but you're alone, and you are running out of options. The best option, obviously, is Franklin Roosevelt and the Americans, and Churchill goes and begs Roosevelt for help. Roosevelt, not wanting to really get the United States involved in a war in the midst of an economic recovery, tries to say this is a European affair. Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, is the ambassador to Britain at this time, and he basically tells Roosevelt that Churchill is crazy, and that this is not going well, and Churchill should sue for peace. Churchill is receiving pressure from the conservatives, particularly Halifax and Chamberlain, who hold huge sway over the Tories, who are trying to convince him to end this war as soon as possible. Churchill is just like Britain. He has run out of allies, and despite the Americans promising aid and relief to them, the British seem like they are alone, and they are going to be in danger. Now, what happens? Churchill is faced with a very big decision. The Germans are willing to wheel and deal, and Halifax is talking to them all the time about this. But Churchill, knowing how pernicious Hitler was, knowing how aggressive he was, realized that Hitler would not stop. So he decides to draw the line and make it clear that Britain was not going anywhere. This is the darkest hour. And Churchill decides to give a speech. Now, according to the movie Darkest Hour, Churchill went out into the streets of London, and he went around the people, and he talked to the common people, and he realized that they would defend Great Britain, and that they loved their country, and that their patriotism would inspire them to fight on no matter what happened, whatever the cost may be. But that might not be true. That might just be embellishment. Churchill gives probably the most famous speech of the 20th century, although there's a lot of famous speeches in the 20th century. And he says, he references Napoleon. He basically asserts that Britain is able to fend for itself. And of course, he utters the famous line, "We will fight on to the end. We will fight on the beaches. We will fight in France. We will fight with growing confidence in the air. We will fight in the streets. We shall never surrender." Probably the most famous speech in British history. And he says, even if we are defeated, our empire will take care of us. And then he makes another incisive prediction. Until the U.S. saves us, until the new world comes to the liberation and salvation of the old. And the conservatives who have been questioning him and wanting to overthrow him and wanting to do what they wanted, Halifax and Chamberlain and the others, give up. And basically they realize they're in for a war, and Churchill isn't going anywhere. He also knows that Hitler is listening, and Hitler will have retribution, and he does in the bombing of Britain. So for the next 5 years, Churchill is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he is going to lead Britain through its darkest hour and into victory. And it's Churchill's efforts that are going to be huge, as he was one man who chose to stand up to the Nazis, to his own in the face of, once again, political failure and his own life on the line, stand up and assert that Britain would never surrender. So we are at an hour, so I think what we're going to do here is I'm going to take, I'm not going to cut the story short. There's still so much to talk about with Churchill. So we're going to do a part 2. We're going to finish talking about Churchill's legacy and his impact, along with maybe a couple other topics next Sunday. I hate to cut it short there, but we have really gone above and beyond. We just hit 2 million views. That's an incredible news. Thank you, Simon. Extra. 2 million people have watched my channel at one point or another, and I really appreciate that. We started this off in February, just doing random videos. It was inspired by my girlfriend, who basically said, hey, you need to share all of this historical knowledge with the world. And I didn't want to do it at first because I like to keep it to myself, but we did short form and then eventually branched out into long form content. And then in May, we started doing the Q&As, and then the live stream lectures began back in August, or September. So there is a lot more to talk about with Churchill, and I could go on for another hour easily, which is why we are going to table this. And then next Sunday for our live stream lecture, I'll be discussing part 2, Churchill during World War II and after World War II. The first half of the story has begun. We've ended at the perfect point where Churchill has decided to stand against the Germans. Find out what happens next week in our live stream lecture, as I'll be finishing up the story of Churchill, and hopefully maybe that'll only be a half an hour or so, but we will be doing more stuff like that. And we will be talking about more things. I have indeed thanked her, but we will indeed be doing the second half of this Churchill talk next week, perhaps with some other topics. If you have any topics, feel free to drop them in the chat that you would like me to discuss. I'm going to stay on for another 5 to 10 minutes and take any questions anyone has, because I know a few of you have come back from Friday and Saturday's live stream Q&A to ask me some interesting questions. So the next few minutes will be an impromptu Ask Me Anything, where you can ask me about any history topics. If you want to wait, if you want to think about topics, come back Friday at 8 p.m. and Saturday at 7 p.m. and join us. I really appreciate talking history with you as well, Jason, and everyone else. Please consider liking and subscribing, telling all your friends and family, checking out that long form content. I've got a 10-minute video about the life and legacy of Churchill, where I discuss much of what I've just discussed. So I really appreciate you guys enjoying everything and liking and subscribing. Your support, feedback is interesting. And so I'm going to take any questions you guys have for the next few minutes, and then we will shut it down. And again, show some love to Simon the Bunny, my moderator, who has done a great job handling the chat. Let me see. If you have, and he has done an amazing job. Show him some love. He's one of the best we've got. So yes, indeed. But yeah, if you have a topic you want me to discuss, if you have something historical, if you have anything about Churchill, which would be nice and on topic, please be sure to drop it in the chat as you're liking and subscribing. Really appreciate all of you guys. And of course, wonderful love to my moderator, Simon the Bunny. So I'm going to finally light this thing and actually smoke it without it going out on me, while you guys maybe think of topics you would like to discuss. And if you'd like to see yourself out, please be sure to like and subscribe. It was so great to see all of you. Thank you for all your love and support. You really make this channel what it is. That's why I don't call myself the Friendly Neighborhood Historian. I realized early on that you guys were the Friendly Neighborhood Historians, because you guys are the ones who are learning about history and asking about it and sharing things with me. And I've learned about history from this channel. I've been wrong about a lot of things. People have come on Q&As, they've come on videos and corrected me, and I've learned and grown because of that. So K-Roach, yes, if you're still here, please, I want to know what post-war consensus, which war. I want to know what you were asking, because I really feel bad for not answering that. Jason is asking, so what was the main reason Britain and France didn't declare war on Russia also when they invaded? Because I think, I kind of answered this a second ago, but I think, Jason, they didn't want to get involved with that. I think they had enough involvement and enough preoccupation with Hitler. And obviously Germany is, before you get to Russia, and Russia and Germany weren't allies. Russia was doing its own thing. I don't think they wanted another war with Russia because war with Russia meant even more loss of life, and they didn't want to push Russia closer to the Germans, and Russia was already really, really strong. What places in history did not get very much affected by World War I, World War II? Latin America, I would say, to a large extent, although the Germans attacked Argentina and Argentina joined the Allies because the Germans kept attacking them with their U-boats. But South America is one of the places that's not heavily affected by World War I and World War II to a great extent. Yeah, he was indeed a fascinating man, Edward, and thank you for yelling that. I appreciate that. Greetings, Squirrel, great to see you. My wonderful moderator is from across the pond. And I got a lot of people who come to the channel who tell me about living in ancient Roman towns or near ancient Roman towns that have been obviously converted and updated with Roman amphitheaters and Roman ruins nearby, which I always find just absolutely fascinating. Did Hitler and Churchill ever talk? Yes, they did, and no, they didn't like each other. Surprise. Ryan Wiku is asking, did Churchill ever have military service? Yes, I talked about it earlier. Churchill served in the Boer War. He was a war correspondent. He toured the British Empire during his 20s. He went to a military academy. If you watch my full-length video on him, there's pictures of him in military garb. Yeah. Churchill's secretary is interesting. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, Churchill had many great speechwriters, and I mean, watch Darkest Hour. Gary Oldman won the Oscar for it. It's obviously an embellished Hollywood-esque telling of it, but it's an incredibly interesting telling. Read John Kelly's book, Never Surrender. John Kelly, a writer for The Atlantic, wrote one of the best books on World War II I've ever read. 1942, which is why we'll talk about that next week. You would think, Simon, that's a great question about who had the best relationship. You would think it was Churchill and Roosevelt. I wouldn't say so. I think you would have to go to Thatcher and Reagan. Boer is B-O-E-R. But basically, if you actually asked about a B-O-E-R, the Boers were a group of people who settled several colonies in South Africa from the Dutch. Basically, the Dutch also settled New York. They hired an Englishman named Henry Hudson, and they took over the land from a tribe called the Manhattan tribe. So they built it. They called it New Amsterdam. That is why it is Bedford-Stuyvesant, Bed-Stuy. New York has actually got a history of the Dutch, and that's why it was called New Amsterdam for a time. But the British took it from them as they did South Africa. Basically, the Dutch had a series of colonists who lived in South Africa for a long time, and the British went in there and tried to take land from them. And the Dutch were known for their fights with the Bantu natives, and the British eventually defeated them. If you actually, of course, study the history, the apartheid was after the British left South Africa, and it was the Dutch Boers trying to keep control against the native South Africans. The British had nothing to do with apartheid, interestingly enough. So the Boer War was basically there were two wars, one in the 1870s and one in the early 1900s, where the Dutch tried to fight the British and kick them out of South Africa, and the British weren't having any of it. In fact, the first concentration camps were invented by the British in the Second Boer War, and Churchill would have seen them to house Dutch prisoners of war and Dutch families. So the first concentration camps were used by the British. Yeah, because it was the Nazis who invaded it, and again, they were trying to avoid war, and they were trying to find a peaceful solution to the war, so they didn't want to drum in Russia into the war either, Jason. So it was one of these things where it's like, we can't stop Hitler, so can we even try to stop Stalin? Do we want Stalin and Hitler to really become friends, let alone agreeing to divide up this land for their own imperialistic notions? I really don't know. So yeah, Thatcher and Reagan, Simon, those are my two. Let me see here. Yeah, we're talking about where people are from, and I love that. Yes, I try to do as much detail as possible. That's what we're here for. What's the story behind Churchill limping all the time with his cane? I don't know. I think Churchill might have had an injury. I'm not 100% sure about that. Obviously, Churchill's drinking hurts your balance, especially if you do it long time. So maybe touch on the East India Company. The East India Company, Britain's company set up by Queen Elizabeth in 1600 to basically trade in the East Indian region, which they called it the East Indian region because supposedly Columbus had founded the West Indian region, which is the Caribbean. But basically, the British East India Company was set up to fight against the Dutch East India Company, which had already started to colonize Java, Jakarta, and of course Indonesia. But the British East India Company obviously spends most of its time in India, and actually, thanks to men like Robert Clive, are able over time, after pitting local Indian rulers against each other, to undermine Indian autonomy and take over. But their repression of the Indians in the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 left the British Empire itself to take over and annex India. So before 1857, the British owned India, but it was actually the British East India Company, not the British Empire itself. Churchill built a wall for himself in his garden in Kent. Yes, I did. I think I've heard something about that before. Excuse me. Wow, there's a cigar. Yeah. Now I feel like Churchill. So yes, I didn't know about Churchill's wall. Again, are you trying to make a Trump comparison because they've made them before? And Churchill was very nativistic in some ways, just like Trump is to some extent. And again, a lot of people, if they read Churchill's writings about people from developing countries, would consider him to be a horrible racist. But again, how much of that is victim of his time? No, I have not heard about that, Squirrel. I don't know a huge amount about that side of Churchill. So I'm gonna take a couple more questions. I do not endorse smoking. I am doing this for show. I have a cigar. I have a pipe here. I smoke them once in a great while. So I really appreciate everyone staying around for the extra mini Q&A session. If anyone has any last questions, we will take them. We'll do two more, and then or three more. Three is a nice semi round number. Three more questions, and then we will sign off. Make sure to like and subscribe to all your friends and family. Yes, I've heard that he wanted to paint. He loved to paint. Yes, there are more cancerous things on YouTube than a cigar. There's nothing wrong with a cigar. Of course, there are potential health risks. People, in fact, interestingly enough, a little history here. Obviously, cigars are the United States. You can't get from Cuba, but Cuban cigars are considered the best in the world. But interestingly enough, before the 1900s, everyone smoked cigars. Cigarettes became popular because they were cheap and easy to use, and in cigars, which the smoke settles in your mouth and you breathe it out, that's how you receive the nicotine. In cigarettes, you obviously inhale it into your lungs, so it's far more dangerous, and it's actually far cheaper. But yes, my great-grandpa served in the Boer War. I think we had a gunpowder horn from it. Oh, that's interesting. That's really, really cool. Some history on Simon the Bunny. So I'll tell you Simon's history here. Yes, and we'll get a hold of King Charles. He doesn't have anything better to do. He's a figurehead. But anyways, or trying to corral his son, I guess. But anyways, I wouldn't call it medicinal. I wouldn't call it that so much. But anyways, although we do put so much nicotine and tar in cigarettes that it's absurd, and tobacco already has enough of it on its own. But anyways, my point being, Simon came to the channel for to watch the live streams, just like you guys are doing right now, and he really enjoyed what we talked about. He really liked it a lot, and so he pledged to basically be my moderator, and he got home early today from seeing some friends, or tonight, I should say, to join us for our live stream. So we really appreciate that. We really love Simon. Yes, and I don't vape, so don't vape. I wonder, what did you find out? You had a question earlier. I think you were asking about the moo call. Interesting. I'll have to read into that. Yeah, I get it. I get why people smoke. If something I noticed watching a lot of cooking shows during the pandemic is chefs smoke all the time. It's a stressful environment, and it's a way to calm people down. Chewing tobacco. Yeah, I tried that once. I hated it. Interesting. I'll have to read into that and see if that's true, Squirrel. Thank you for telling me that. But Magnus, I support your effort to end smoking. There are other ways, and I understand where you're coming from. There's other ways and methods to treat your mental health without having to use cigarettes, but I get why you do, and I don't judge. I'm very libertarian, at least in my behavior. I don't judge. I let people be who they are, and that's why I'm a free speech absolutist, and people can say whatever crazy nonsense they want, and if it's going to be such a huge distraction, my wonderful moderator takes care of it for me. Interesting. What realm is inverted in many ways? I don't know what you mean, Squirrel. Waffen. The city of Waffen? Wonder? What do you mean by the Greek translation of apocalypse? That was a good one, Lakshmi. Am I alone from the bank because you have my interest? Yes, at a high rate too, high American interest rates right now. That's very fascinating. Oh, the SS division. Okay, I will take one more question and then we're going to call it a day. I hope you guys have a great week ahead of you. But one more question, last call, and everything. And we will see you back on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So bright and early, 1 a.m. in Paris. Please consider liking and subscribing, telling all your friends and family. I will, Magnus. I'd try to make a video for everyone who subscribes. I don't have 5,000 videos yet, but if somebody subscribes and they ask for a video, I do one in their honor. So Don Pedro II, I'm going to look into him. Mughals. So I talked about the Mughals a little bit. They're the ones who built the Taj Mahal. They're the ones that the British basically bully into losing their autonomy with the British East India Company. I'm trying to remember. Akbar was the man who founded them, overcoming the weakened Delhi Sultanate to build an empire, and they are the ones that actually conquer most of the Indian subcontinent united into one country. What's my favorite era? Whichever one I'm learning about currently, I really enjoy that. I like to learn, to sponge as much history as I can. There are pyramids all over the world. The pyramids in Egypt were used as burial mounds and to honor their gods. Interesting. Fascinating. Yes, apocalypse is a revelation. I agree. That is very true. I'm so glad you like history. You found the right place. Consider liking and subscribing. We're here for every Sunday for our live stream lecture. We will be doing part 2 of Winston Churchill. You heard it live here, folks. Next Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and of course Friday and Saturday 8 and 7 respectively. We will be doing our live stream Q&A. Ask me anything, where you can ask me anything about history. Thank you. The lamp was causing a really bad glare earlier, so I got rid of it. But yeah. Yes, it's not the Latin is a reduction of that. I am in the United States. I do not give my specific information. Even my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, does not know where I am at. But if you are interested in learning more Lurventut, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, please consider liking and subscribing, telling all your friends and family. How do you keep very sharp mentally? I try to read. I listen to classical music. I try to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep. It's not easy for people like me, but yeah. Yes. Anyways, we are going to sign off now. Thank you for joining us from Sweden. Wonderful country. Just learning about Charles the 12th and he just died yesterday. Although it's technically December 11th, but in his calendar was November 30th, according to the Julian calendar. In 1718, he was shot mysteriously through the head. Charles the 12th, the last great king of Sweden. You're thinking of Poltava when he was defeated by Peter the Great. Yes, that is definitely true. Hearts of Iron is a great game and a great way to become somebody who understands. Yes, I love this lamp too. It's kind of got that Baroque design, really like it, Tiffany style. And if I have it on, as Beyonce said, it's my halo. And now it's flickering. Oh, great. Bad timing for that. There we go. It's my halo. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate each and every single one of you and all your commentary and feedback. I hope you guys have a great week, and we will see you Friday at 8 p.m. for our wonderful Q&A. And I don't know what time it is in Sweden right now, but I don't know what time it would be then, Lurventut, but I'm so glad to see you, and I hope you can join us for then. I hope you guys have a great week. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, where we bring you friendly history all the time. Take care and have a great week. Bye, guys.